So talk to me and kind of give me a brief overview about how America got involved in Vietnam and where that started.
Well, I think the U.S. got involved, and of course, it's a long story. France, of course, had made Vietnam a colony, and as making it a colony, of course, the people of Vietnam didn't want to be a colony, just like, the U.S. didn't want to be colonies during that time. Ho Chi Minh is going to be a leader of the opposition. Ho Chi Minh is somewhat influenced by the communists, but also he's influenced because he attempts to get the help of the United States to recognize him and recognize them as an independent nation. For example, he tries to get in touch with Woodrow Wilson in France when he's doing the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson kind of ignores him. After he declared independence, he wrote Harry Truman and asked Truman to recognize him, and that didn't work out either. And then, of course, obviously that Ho Chi Minh was somewhat of a communist during that time. But really what we're going to see is one thing the U.S. becomes involved first, kind of because they don't want to lose France as an ally. And then, of course, they're opposed to Ho Chi Minh's communist background.
So I know they were first as advisors to South Vietnam.
Yeah.
And then how did we get involved fully military-wise?
Going from that, really what it was, it's obviously very, very complicated, but the president of South Vietnam was not totally popular in South Vietnam during that time. And they needed to stabilize themselves. They weren't a country that could defeat North Vietnam by themselves. And we said, Johnson said, for example, Kennedy to some extent said, that what we need to do is we need to help to stabilize South Vietnam. And so we'll take over somewhat the war while you stabilize your country and stabilize your government.
And so on that, I know that there was, I think, what was it, two ships that were attacked, right? And that kind of led us into where we became involved, where we took, boots on the ground military action.
Yeah. For example, one of the ideas that was done by Kennedy, and Johnson really revved it up a little, Lyndon Johnson really revved it up a little, is the idea of sending the U.S. ships into waters either just off the North Vietnamese coast or even within the international boundary of North Vietnam. And they would help South Vietnamese commandos. There was, for example, in August of 1964, there was an attack of the South Vietnamese commandos against some of the North Vietnamese islands. And when the ship, the USS Maddox, was near these islands, then of course North Vietnamese came out to investigate. Shots were fired between the Maddox and the North Vietnamese during that time. Really at that time, it's not quite the effort, it's not quite the the U.S. sees that we have been fired on, but they say, okay, keep going north. So you're in, enemy waters or near enemy waters during that time. And the enemy, of course, North Vietnam, is becoming somewhat concerned, obviously, about them going into the northern waters. The USS Maddox and the Turner Joy keep going farther north. There is that night, August 4th of 1964, so 2 nights later, there actually is going to be a stormy night, and of course the sonar men on these ships are anxious, are scared about what's going on, and they feel very sure that they've been fired on by the North Vietnamese, although there is no visual sighting because of the dark night. The next morning, it looked like they weren't sure. The commander of the USS Maddox writes back to Washington and says, I'm not sure if we were fired on. I'm not sure if we should do this. I'm not sure. We may have been fired on, some people have said, but we may not have. But, and let us investigate. Well, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and others are going to take this as the opportunity, I guess, to get into the war more during that time. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is going to give the president the right to retaliate against North Vietnamese. So, in some instances, starts bombing, and then more bombing happens during that time, and eventually leads into U.S. troops being introduced. So there's never really a declaration of war. There's never really a congressional declaration of war. Lyndon Johnson says that. Actually, it is said by Johnson and some of his advisors, if we're going to go farther, we'll come back and get a declaration of war, but they never do that. So
talk to me a little bit about how this conflict is different from any other conflict before. I know that's kind of a tougher question, but yeah. How is this different?
I believe it's different because of first, World War II, obviously, they said we have to stop Hitler. And World War II, people were behind that, and they said that's what we're doing, and, I hate that my son has to go over there, but I feel that this is what we need to do. Vietnam, there was no support, there was high support at first, but then, especially as more casualties began to come back, people began to ask, well, why are we over here? And, they're trying to say, we got to stop Ho Chi Minh, but Ho Chi Minh is not a Hitler, during that time. So they're saying, why is my son going over there? Why is my son facing this? Why are we facing this during this time?
Now, I know that Vietnam is often considered the first televised war. So how does that also play into that, where people are watching this on TV, seeing what's happening over there, and their ideas are formed about what war is? Because I know that with World War II, you had the serials.
Yeah.
But this is different.
Yeah. Well, it's every night you're seeing something of this, right? During this time, we're seeing, of course, the war, I guess, being fought out. It's not like you're seeing a lot of casualties, things like this during this time. So I think TV has got a lot more blame than it deserves for turning the U.S. against the war. I think the people had started doing this, and television followed it. I think probably one of the biggest reasons of this change is in 1971. Yeah, 1971, I believe. There was actually a Life magazine that had the pictures of the soldiers who had died in South Vietnam that week. And there were, 200 or whatever. And people would see these pictures and see these young men in the prime of their lives, and they would say, well, why is it that this is being done? We don't understand. They haven't made us understand why we have to stop Ho Chi Minh and why we have stopped communism during that time. And why is that a threat to the United States? And why is it a threat to where I should send my son over there to go fight and die during that time?
And so how does also the culture play into maybe that kind of the resistance of, you had the hippie movement, you had flower power happening, you had the civil rights movement happening at the same time. So how does that also play into that resistance of the war, or maybe that turning point of maybe people not fully supporting the war?
I think that, first, I think we have to realize that the nation is undergoing some important changes, like with for example, the African American Civil Rights Movement is starting to say, well, the government has kept us down, and we're going to question the government, and we're going to say, well, everything in the government is not just right during this time. There are a lot of problems. So if you're growing up and you're looking at this, how the government is treating African Americans, for example, during that time, and you're saying, well, I'm going to question my government more. And then this war comes on, and you say, well, is this a war that we should be involved in, for example? For example, a lot of people are going to say that this is not a war of aggression. This is not a war of the communists trying to conquer this. This is more of a civil war. This is more of a war of South Vietnam is split. This is more of a war of South Vietnam versus North Vietnam. It's not a Cold War that the U.S. should be involved in. And we can never understand, they said, why U.S. soldiers are sent there. And we can't understand this. And that's why people are going to look at it and say, well, maybe we can. We've seen, for example, with the civil rights movement, we have seen that people can question their government during this time. So, maybe we should, on the biggest thing that the government does, decide if someone goes to war, should that not be questioned? Should that not be an issue? Should we not be involved in that as well? In World War II, like we said, people understood that we need to go there. And they said, okay, the government's doing the best for us, and we can believe the government and things like that. But, how can we believe the government? And people would start to say, is the government even telling us the truth about what's going on? Is the government doing this? For example, the government said in 1967, we are winning this war, and the enemy is on the run. Well, the Tet Offensive comes along, and the enemy is going to, although they are defeated militarily, it shows that they are still strong, and that they are still strong enough to attack and to make the attack against them. And people are saying, hey, what is this? Why did the government tell us one thing when obviously it wasn't true during that time? So they're going to argue that and this kind of idea.
And so, kind of jumping onto that, I know you hear stories of when soldiers returned home, they were called names, baby killer and other things like that. So, talk to me a little bit about, we hear those stories and stuff like that. And maybe you hear stories about they were treated, where they were thanked and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about that idea of these soldiers returning home and maybe there was certain vitriol towards these certain soldiers who may have, they were just doing their job. They were just over there. But talk to me a little bit about that as well.
I think, the opposition of doing that would be more, I guess, on the West Coast, maybe when they came home directly. But I think what the issue might have been is that soldiers did not receive any recognition, really, of what we have done. For example, I spoke with one veteran about it, and he said that when I came home, it wasn't so much that people spat on me, and that's, I think, way overdone on that, but it's that they ignored me, didn't want to. For example, here at WT, for example, the veterans of World War II, when they came home, they went to college here, they wanted everyone to know they were veterans. They wore their uniform, they were doing this, they were proud. When the veterans came home from Vietnam, they wanted to, in the most parts, not all, but most parts, they just wanted to fit in and forget about anything like that. For example, when they came home, one of the first things they did was grow their hair long, some of these, because we want to fit in. We don't want to be shown as being a veteran of this war during this time.
And so, maybe you can answer this, maybe you can't. How has that changed lately where people, maybe the past, 20 years, of people finally starting to recognize what Vietnam veterans have done and just those soldiers who were over there?
I think that, recently, obviously, we have seen a lot of praise, that the pendulum has swung a lot, obviously. And there is a lot of praise of soldiers, a lot of respect that we had. For example, during the Gulf War or after the Gulf War, there was a lot of praise of the individual soldiers. There was a lot of this, that, they had done such a good job. I think that some of that praise has to be said of almost a guilty conscience, that after this, there wasn't we didn't look at the soldiers. We didn't give them a lot of recognition, things like that. And that was, it's hard to do when you spend a year or whatever in South Vietnam, and you have no, you felt that when I was there, what I was doing, it seemed to be important, but it doesn't seem to be important now. Nobody's looking at that, during that time. We see, for example, some of the veterans coming home actually and joining with the peace movement and saying, this is what's happening. What's our country doing? They're just taking advantage of us the soldiers sending us here, making us fight or whatever, and there's no recognition, no caring or whatever during that time.
So, going to the fall of Saigon in 1975, talk to me a little bit about, we heard a lot of comparisons to when we left Afghanistan,
Yeah.
of those two, about how it was handled and everything like that. Do you think that was kind of I don't want to say stain, but kind of a thing that the U.S. didn't really want to bring up again, when it kind of like when we left Afghanistan and people were comparing that,
Yeah.
it was like that was a rough spot, and it was kind of
Yeah.
a rough thing that people did not want that to be compared
Okay.
to.
Well, I'm going to go back a little.
Okay.
Okay. After the war, there was something called the Vietnam Syndrome. And the Vietnam Syndrome kind of said, we're not going to do anything to get involved in the war again. So it was very difficult for the United States to ever want to get in the war. So they said, we've been burned, we've been burned in Vietnam, and this is what we can't have happening anymore during that time. So really in the late 70s, people were very shy. America was very shy of going to a war, of getting involved in anything during this time. For example, what we're going to see, in the early 80s, when there was some talk of the U.S. getting involved in Nicaragua, that people were very scared of it and saying, we don't want to do it because it'll be another Vietnam. We know it will. So we're going to, just stay out as much as we can during this time. It gets a little more, and I think the 90s, the Gulf War perhaps might have helped somewhat with this. But there was always that Vietnam syndrome that we had, and as in Afghanistan, I ask my students, I say, when have you heard the name Vietnam last? And you're going to hear it in Afghanistan. Is Afghanistan going to be another Vietnam? Is the Gulf War going to be another Vietnam? Is, for example, Iraq will turn into another Vietnam? Those kind of things. I think that when we got out of Afghanistan, obviously there were a lot of mistakes that were made during that time, and I think the kind of chaotic nature of us leaving Afghanistan would somewhat be, compared, and can be compared to the chaotic nature of Saigon. I think there's, differences. Obviously, we have to see the U.S. had been, really the military, had been out of Vietnam since 1973. And so there was a small, embassy, whatever, during that time. But it was, I think we have to say somewhat chaotic during that time. But, I think we can't compare totally. All right.
I'm going to ask you a question. I brought a piece of paper with me.
Okay.
And again, you may not be able to answer this question or not. This is the U.S. Census from 1980 with Vietnamese refugees that came.
Yeah.
Because we know that several
Yeah.
came after the fall of Vietnam.
Yeah.
So we know that 994 people from Vietnam were here in Amarillo
Yeah.
In 1980. So would you know how many of those were refugees, or were all of those refugees?
I would bet all of those were refugees who had left. I bet, I mean, they had to get out of South Vietnam, which was now Vietnam, because when the communists took over during that time, there was going to be retaliation, and there was going to be executions that are going to happen if you had helped the United States, for example. You know, just like, for example, the people in Afghanistan that were helping with the United States, now that they were wanting to get out. And some of them can't get out, unfortunately. And if the Taliban finds out, then they're going to be executed during that time. But yes, I would say probably by 1980, all of them were. For example, an example that really is amazing to me, in the fall of 1975, there was one young co-ed from South Vietnam who was here, who had just escaped months earlier. So, you know, already in the unit, already at WT, already at West Texas State during that time. So I think that's, you know, very interesting to look at. So yes, you know, there were a lot of refugees that came here during this time. There's an article actually about many of them that's in the recent Panhandle Plains Historical Review. That's a very important article that a lot of people did come. A lot of people did come. A lot of the boat people, as they were called, or whatever, because of this. And finally, they come through Houston, many of them. Many of them, of course, into Amarillo because of Iowa beef processors. And of course, you know, that they get jobs, things like that, which would draw them. And so it was I think a lot of refugees did come during that time. And that's an important thing, I think, that we should understand, that, you know, we do have a lot of refugees, that the United States did accept a lot of refugees into this country. Unfortunately, there was some opposition, obviously, as you know, to this, especially when Vietnamese refugees, for example, would buy shrimp boats and go into other areas where Americans had been shrimping, and there was some opposition there. But you know, I think we have seen this, and we have seen the growth of the community during that time.
Yeah. You kind of touched on my next point. I was going to ask you: was there really any kind of opposition to Vietnamese refugees coming over here?
There were some, as I must say, there was some opposition to the refugees. No, of course, economics is going to drive that you're taking away from, you know, our, for example, shrimping business or whatever else that we see. So, and yes, there's opposition, and you know, we see in Amarillo, of course, many of the Vietnamese refugees live in a similar area where, you know, where they are among other refugees at that time. So that's important, obviously, to look at. Yeah.
Dr. Kuhlman, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think, you know, Vietnam obviously has a lot of controversy about this. I think the U.S. being involved, the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, were 70s, of course. We see some of this, so I think it does have an impact, obviously. It has a lot of influence on what goes on today, really, you know, the idea that we see, the opposition. Some people might say, well, the opposition were disloyal. Other people would say, of course, the opposition led us to get out of a unjust war or something like this. So there are still a lot of issues. People, of course, still alive from that period, what they had done, things like that.
One more thing. Is it interesting to see us kind of now partnered with, I know we do a lot of trading and stuff like that with Vietnam. Is it kind of interesting to
you're
see
right. That's good point. We do really, during the Clinton years, things like that, they did start to say, we're going to trade, we're going to recognize, we're going to look at this. There was a lot of controversy during the 80s, especially over the MIAs that we're still missing. MIAs, which are about 10 times less, at least 10 times less than in World War II. There were a lot more MIAs in World War II than in Vietnam, but there was still opposition to that. Starting by the 90s, especially starting with the fall of the Soviet Union. No longer did Vietnam really have a sponsor state. So now we're going to move a little more towards capitalism, these sorts of things. So I think, that's what we have. Just like Japan, nobody would have thought in 1946 that Japan is one of the biggest allies of the United States, that nobody would think that Vietnam is going to be one of the biggest allies of the U.S. as well, at this time. So I think that's a very, important thing for us to look at, important thing for us to realize that there are, it always changes, things always change.